everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and we are back with another new episode. We are continuing my series on Cenozoic bird evolution. Um, so this should be a pretty exciting episode. I guess before we get started, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Um, Things have been good on my end. It's currently rainy, rainy, rainy.
Mm.
So if you hear brief like flashes of rain on that,
Mm.
that's on my end.
Right,
Um,
right.
but it shouldn't be good. Otherwise, uh, I've been keeping up with the usual pop culture things. For those in the know, Cosmos is back on television. They had a brief hiatus because they were covering baseball as well as the presidential elections,
Yes.
which ended on a nice note,
Yeah,
incidentally.
yeah, indeed. We were still awaiting results the last time we recorded, but fortunately, it seems that the world is not going to end immediately. So there's that.
Right, and hopefully we'll be due for some sanity in our in my government in our government at least
Right.
as we move forward to work towards issues of science and culture.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, um it's always fun. Always keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, you can put it that way. But indeed, well, yeah, that sounds pretty good. We've been having a bit of rain over here as well, but not too much. Mostly it happens in the middle of the night or early in the morning or something, and doesn't affect people too much, at least not directly. So yeah, sounds good. Okay, I guess we can jump in then. So yeah, today's episode I've been looking forward to for a while, and that's because we're about to talk about probably my favorite group of birds. Um, and if you know me, you probably know that I've written a few scientific papers about this particular group. But even before I started like actually researching them, I think this was already my one of my favorite bird groups. And if you don't know how amazing they are, hopefully you will after this episode. So, yes, this group of birds is called the Strisores, and they include the hummingbirds, like the one pictured on this first slide here. But they also include the swifts and the nightjars and a number of other very weird bird groups. So, we will be meeting them today.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, can't wait, right? So I named this episode the buzzers overhead, and that's because the name Strisores translates to the buzzers, not to be confused with buzzards, which are not members of Strisores. um, yeah, but the person whoever came up with the name Strisores, Cabanis, he it's interesting because the when this name was originally coined, it actually referred to a larger group of birds than just the ones that it refers to currently in current taxonomy. So there was various other arboreal birds that were included in this group, but today it's kind of used in a more restricted sense. But it's still a very appropriate name for this group because, of course, you have hummingbirds which kind of buzz around, kind of like insects almost. Um, and you have kind of swifts that fly, kind of whiz through the air. Um, Nightjars also kind of fly very quickly through the air, and these also have these very at least some of them have these very elaborate flight displays where they kind of zip through the air very quickly and create a kind of loud booming noise with their feathers. So it's kind of neat. So either way, it's a pretty appropriate name for this group of birds. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the group as a whole. So the fossil record of this group is surprisingly good, I would say, because these are some pretty delicate birds. So I've studied, the skeletons of many members of this group, and a lot of them many of the major bones they have, especially the skull, are made of really, really thin bone, like literally paper thin. Um, and plus, you have a lot of members of this group that are very small, like the hummingbirds. So they're not a group that you would expect to fossilize very well. But it seems that they were lucky enough to be quite abundant in some places in the distant past that are very good at preserving bird fossils. Places like the Messel Shale in Germany and the Green River Formation in North America, both of which date to the Eocene. And so these formations actually preserve quite a large number of these birds. So, as we shall see, many of the major groups are actually well represented in the fossil record. So, they are known from the Eocene all the way to present day. They are quite diverse, over 500 living species today, most of which are hummingbirds, as we shall see. And the vast majority of them have a short, broad beak, of course, with the obvious exceptions of the very long, narrow beak in hummingbirds. But yeah, you can see on the slide here, I pictured skulls from some of the major groups of Strisores here. And these are pictured basically, you're seeing the upper part of the skull, so without the lower jaws, from below. So you're looking up at the palate, basically, of these birds, and you can see that most of them have this very broad bill. And the two kind of narrow rod-like bones on either side of the face, if you will, those are basically the cheekbones, you can say, and kind of in the space above the palate, but inside, bounded by the cheekbones would be where the eyeballs go. You can probably infer from this that a lot of these birds have very large eyes. Now, you can also see that the part of the beak that protrudes in front of the eyes is mostly pretty small in most of these birds. So, in the Potoo, for example, in the upper right, labeled with the letter C here, the part of the beak that protrudes in front of those cheekbones is very, very short compared to the rest of the skull. And that is true for most of the other groups as well. With some exceptions. So the oilbird on the upper left, with the letter A, has a much narrower bill, though it kind of deviates from that trend. And the frogmouth, which is in the middle on the top, it has a very broad bill, but the length of the bill is much longer than in the other members of this group. And we will see some reasons why that might be, why these groups might be different. But for most part, many of the members of this group have these very, very short but wide bills. And the reason for this is probably because insects are often an important component of their diet. So in most members of Strisores, insects are quite significant in terms of their diet, even for hummingbirds. As I will talk about later, hummingbirds, even though they mostly eat nectar, they do still have to eat quite a lot of insects in order to get enough protein, so they retain insect catching abilities. And in the other members of Strisores, insects can be most or even all of the diet, which a lot of them will catch while they're flying through the air, and so they kind of use these very short, broad bills to kind of scoop insects up while they're flying. They are not very indiscriminate feeders, however, so they are actually somewhat selective about the insects that they catch. So, for example, a lot of them will avoid the stinging insects like bees and wasps, for example. So they're not just like flying through the air and just scooping up whatever. They're like actively kind of chasing after their prey and then catching them using their very wide beak, which basically serves as an insect net. Something else that's pretty curious about Strisores is that a lot of them can enter a state called torpor, and we have talked about torpor before on this show. Yeah, so it probably sound familiar. Torpor is a state where a lot of animals are able to go into, where they basically reduce their metabolism dramatically and go into kind of a dormant condition, which allows them to conserve energy when they need to. And this is quite important. for many members of Strisores, but especially the hummingbirds, because hummingbirds have such a fast metabolism that they have to eat almost constantly. Um, so, how do they get through the night when it's really cold and, it's not light is not optimal for foraging? Well, they go into torpor, and so they just kind of shut themselves down for the entire night, and then in the morning they wake up again. They do this every single night, and not all members of Strisores are that extreme in terms of their torpor. Some of them might only do this like in the winter time, for example, times when food is especially scarce. But the fact remains that a lot of them are capable of going into this state, which is some birds can do it, but outside of this group, they're not. It's not super common in birds. In fact, Strisores includes the only birds that are known to hibernate. And so hibernation can be seen as a very extreme form of torpor. Basically, it's when you go into torpor for not just a few hours at a time, but for most of an entire season. In this case, winter. So there's one species of nightjar called the common porwheel that has been recorded to hibernate, and it is the world's only known hibernating bird that goes through torpor for several days at a time during the winter. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when reading about this group of birds, you might often come across a term Caprimulgiformes, and the kind of vernacular equivalent of that would be Caprimulgiforms. And so this term is still often used, but kind of in a different sense from the way it is traditionally used. So it used to be that Caprimulgiforms included all nocturnal members of Strisores, and many members of Strisores are nocturnal. So the nightjars, for example, the Potoos, the Frogmouths, and the Oilbirds. But it turns out we have later found that some nocturnal Strisorians are more closely related to the diurnal hummingbirds and swifts than to other nocturnal members of Strisores. And so we now kind of use this term differently because we now know that the nocturnal members of the group don't actually form a clade exclusive to themselves. Instead, some people restrict the term Caprimulgiforms only to the nightjars, so they exclude the frogmouths and the Potoos and the Oilbirds and the Owlet-nightjars. So that's kind of my personal preference, and some other people also use it that way. But another very common way it is now used is that it's actually used for all members of Strisores. So a lot of people now include the hummingbirds and swifts as well in the Caprimulgiformes. So kind of different taxonomic systems, I guess. But either way, it is kind of used differently from how we used to use it.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a way to. I guess if you're a stickler for that sort of thing, you want to keep all these sort of higher group names the same-ish. The traditional orders. I guess I can see why people would want to still use Caprimulgiforms for the whole group. I do know some researchers I've seen, like they recognize like the relationship between the nocturnal birds and the swifts and hummingbirds, but like the way that they show it is like they still have a branch where it's Caprimulgiforms and
Right.
Potoos together. When it's like, well, you're close, but you're not exactly.
You're right, right. That's not quite correct. Yeah, because some of the nocturnal birds should be closer to the Apodiforms, the hummingbirds and swifts. So,
Right.
right, right. So yeah, indeed, indeed. But I guess before we go further, do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
All right. So okay, let's look at each of the major groups in turn then. And so the first I have up here are the nightjars on the next slide, Caprimulgidae. So nightjars are one of the more kind of wide-ranging groups of Strisores. Currently, they can be found pretty much worldwide except Antarctica, though they're found on all the other continents. And they're pretty diverse. There are over 90 extant species. Now, a lot of these species are actually not very well studied because these birds are nocturnal, so they're not that easy to study to begin with. And so there are some species, for example, where we're not quite sure if they are actually distinct from other recognized species, and there are other species that just haven't been seen in a long time. There is one particular species that is only known from a severed wing, Like,
Oh,
yeah, like no one has seen it alive before. At least no one knowingly uh, has seen it alive before, and so it's just known from this severed wing that's sitting in a museum somewhere. So very unusual. So definitely a rather mysterious group in some ways. Um, their fossil record, unusually enough, I mentioned that Strisores has a surprisingly good fossil record, but the nightjars actually don't really. There are some very fragmentary fossils from the Eocene that have been suggested to be possibly stem nightjars, but they're really fragmentary, so it's hard to be sure. Other than that, I think the nightjar fossil record mostly starts in like much more recently, like in the Pleistocene. Uh, yeah, mm, the fossil record is not great compared to the other members of Strisores, even though they are very diverse and wide ranging today. Yeah, so there are one of the groups that are crepuscular and nocturnal. Crepuscular, if you don't know, uh, describes animals that are active kind of during dawn and dusk. So they're not quite active in the dead of night or in the middle of the day, but they'll be active in kind of these transition time zones. Um, have you seen common nighthawk over where you live?
honestly, no. I
Hmm.
even when I'm out late,
Yeah.
I imagine like part of it is well, I'm not out at like the right times,
Yeah.
but also it's like we live near the woods,
Hmm.
but like where we're at is not in the woods.
Right.
So maybe it's not the sort of environment to find these birds.
Yeah, maybe. They do like to fly in like relatively open regions, or these nighthawks do. I do know like back when I lived in Maryland, they weren't super common. Like I I saw them maybe like once or twice in my entire time there, which was around 4 years. Um, but yeah, sometimes when the it's getting close to sunset and you're in the right kind of habitat, you might be able to see them kind of flying around. Pretty cool. Um,
Yeah, I'm usually able to see owls and
mhm.
bats more than I am night jars or
Oh
any of
wow.
the nocturnal members of this
Yeah.
group.
Right.
Um,
Right.
do they have any distinct calls? I guess
Yeah.
that I could learn.
Yeah. They do. For example, the whippoorwill is named after its call. Um,
Oh, of course, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's another one that is found in the eastern U.S. Although I think it's, if anything, it's even less commonly seen than the nighthawk. Um, so yeah, good luck with that.
Right.
But yeah, nonetheless, there is a chance that you could see or hear them where you live.
That's just to pay more attention, I'm sure.
Yeah, I guess so. Um, yeah, they're definitely very cool to see. I said I only saw like nighthawk a couple of times back in Maryland. Yeah, they are pretty distinctive. So the wings are very long. They don't flap super fast. The flapping has been described in field guides as being kind of like moth-like. So it's kind of a somewhat slow flapping, although they can their actual airspeed can be pretty quick. Um, and much larger than a typical swift or a swallow. And nightjars, or sorry, the common nighthawk at least has these kind of white bands on its wings, one on either wing, um, that are very distinctive. So yeah, keep an eye out, and you might be able to see them. Um, yeah. So right, they capture insects in flight. So they're one of the kind of, yeah, they kind of swoop through the air, scooping up insects in their mouth. Some of the larger nightjars will actually hunt small vertebrates, like smaller birds. So that's kind of neat. There's one called the Chuckwell's widow, which is also found in North America, which has been found with like smaller birds inside its stomach. Um, so they are capable of catching larger prey if they're big enough. Um, Something kind of unusual about the nightjars compared to the other members of Strisores is that they tend to lay their eggs on the ground, and I would say nest on the ground, but they don't really build a nest. Like they don't even like scrape out like a depression or anything in the ground. They just kind of find somewhere that looks good and just plop down and lay their eggs right there.
Oh. Well, that works.
Yeah, I know some nighthawks will also nest on like the tops of flat-topped buildings and things, but basically, they like to lay their eggs in kind of flat areas. And well, thing is, nightjars are very hard to find during the day because they are very well camouflaged. You can probably tell from the photo here, this common nighthawk here. They're pretty drab with like these very complex patterns on them. Um, and so when they're sitting on the ground in the suitable habitat, like gravel or in some cases on the forest floor, they can be very, very difficult to see. And so that's kind of how they protect themselves during the day and also how they protect their eggs. So when an adult is sitting on top of the eggs, it's very difficult to find the nest. Now, even though they are not, very colorful birds, some species do have very elaborate plumages in the males for display purposes, and some of these get really crazy. Um, so if you have the chance, you should go and Google the standard winged nightjar, and it's not called that because it has very normal looking, as in standard wings. It's called that because um, the males have these super long feathers, like one really long feather on each wing that looks a lot like a streamer or like a banner. So it means standard in that sense, as in the noun. Um, so it's called the standard wing nightjar because it has these super long feathers on like each of its wings for display, and when it's flying, they kind of just trail behind it, and like these feathers they kind of have these really really long shafts. So they have this really long narrow shaft, coming off the wing, and then a big tuft. That's the rest of the feather at the very tip, and this tuft can you know it's a feather, so it's light, but in terms of like the space it takes up, it can look basically bigger than the body of the bird. Uh, so it's crazy. And yeah, there's another species of nightjar with a very similar setup. So the other one is called the pennant winged nightjar, and that one has or not a naked shaft like the standard wing does, but a kind of feather that looks like a long streamer that extends from each wing that has kind of branches coming off of it all the way down. So similar idea, but yeah, equally crazy. very very spectacular birds if you are fortunate enough to see them. Um, let's see. Do you have anything else to add about nightjars?
Well, I'll certainly comment that like clearly that they are, I guess, drabish colored, the browns and tans and
Hmm.
sandy colors, but like you could argue like that they are colorful in that respect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like certainly, like if they were, you talking about the camouflaging uh, abilities for these birds. Like certainly, if I'm walking in the woods and one is just hanging out on the ground, I would almost certainly miss it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. You could say that they have a lot of different color tones, even though they aren't like very bright colors, I guess. Yeah. So for sure, and we will see some other members of Strisores are also very good at the camouflage game. Oh, actually, before I move on, there is a research group that studies nightjar camouflage, and they have a website where you can play a game called like I think it's called like Find the Nightjar or something like that.
Ooh,
I'll link it in the description when I
yeah.
find it. Yeah, yeah. So it's basically it's a game that actually when you play it, you help with their research because they're basically trying to figure out how easy it is to see nightjars against different backgrounds and from different angles and things like that. So you can play the game and help them figure that out. So you will be timed, and then you have to try and click on the nightjar within the time frame they give you, and kind of the faster you manage to find it, it kind of tells them something about how conspicuous the nightjar is in a given habitat. So that's pretty cool. All right,
Yeah.
I guess we can go to the next group. Yeah, okay. So the next group is a weird group, even by the standards of Strisores, which is already a kind of a pretty unusual group in itself. So this group, the Oilbirds, only includes one living species, the oilbird. It is found in South America, but there are fossils of stem oilbirds from North America and Europe, so they used to be a lot more widespread in the past. Now, the oilbird is another nocturnal group, uh, but unlike the other members of Strisores, it does not eat insects at all. It only eats fruit, and that's all it eats. And I think, in fact, it is one of the few nocturnal bird species that is herbivorous. So that's unusual. and it finds these fruits with eyesight. Most member Strisores, they forage by eyesight, but what's unusual about the oilbird is that it has uh, multiple layers of what we call rod cells in the eyes, and so rod cells are especially sensitive to uh, low kind of low light. Um, so they're very good for night vision. So we have rod cells too, but not nearly as many as the oilbird. So we're not that good at seeing in the dark. Um, but the oilbird has like many layers of rod cells in its eyes, and I think it has something like the highest density of rod cells for any vertebrate or something like that. So it's a very unusual setup, and as we will talk about towards the end of the episode, this is not a setup that is seen, or at least known, for the other members of Strisores, which has some implications for the evolution of their kind of nocturnal habits. Um, yeah, so eats fruit, but it lives in caves during the day, so it sleeps in caves and nests in caves. And when it's in caves, it does not navigate so much with its eyesight, but instead with echolocation, which also makes it, it's another very strange feature. Um, uh, there are very few other birds that use echolocation. We'll see some other ones later in the episode, but this is one of the few that do. And so in caves, you know, if you're not familiar with echolocation, it's basically when you emit a sound and then use the echo of the sound kind of bouncing off other objects to tell you that there is something ahead of you, and that way you can kind of navigate. So of course, bats are very famous for using echolocation. There are a number of other animals that do, but very few birds do this, and so oilbird is one of the exceptions. So very weird. Do you have anything else to add about the oilbird?
No, it's a fascinating bird for sure.
Yeah, I guess while I'm here, I might as well mention why they're called oilbirds. So they like to eat fruits that are very high in oil content, and because the babies are fed on this fruit, um, in particular, they grow very fat. Um, well, kind of an unfortunate thing is that early explorers encountering these birds found this out and decided to use them as fuel. Uh, so yeah, they would capture the babies and light them on fire, basically. So yeah, that's a kind of a rather unfortunate origin of their name. Um, but fortunately, the oilbird is not currently endangered, so they are still doing pretty well.
Well, I hope they're not still lighting these birds.
As far as I know, as far as I know, that is no longer practiced. But yeah, yeah. So on the next slide, I have shown one of the fossil examples of the oilbird lineage. So this is Prefica from the Eocene. It's from the Green River Formation I mentioned earlier, so it was found in Wyoming. Um, and it's a bit of a jumbled up mess, this specimen, but you can probably tell it's basically a complete skeleton. Towards the lower right, you can see kind of that triangle shape. That is the skull, or at least the lower jaws. You can kind of recognize that shape there. And kind of the longer bones that you can see, the long thin bones mostly, are the wing bones, and you can also see probably the at least one of the feet near the bottom. Um, and towards the top, you can kind of see a series of vertebrae. Those are the tail vertebrae. You can see it ending in a pygostyle, kind of fused tail vertebrae that all or most modern birds have. Um, and so Prefica is smaller than the living oilbird. So the living oilbird is like it's a pretty decently sized bird. It's like the size of a crow, maybe I'd estimate. This Eocene stem oilbird is smaller than that, like half the size around. But its skull does show some similarities to the modern oilbird, so it might have already been eating fruit. Its wing skeleton does show some differences. So the modern oilbird, it is kind of specialized for hovering. Not quite like hovering like a hummingbird hovers, but it is able to hover for brief periods. Usually in caves, for example, if it needs to like avoid collision with an object, or while it's feeding on fruit, it might hover in place and pluck fruit from a tree. Um, but it seems like Prefica did not have these specializations for hovering yet, so it's probably feeding a little differently from the modern oilbird, although maybe still already feeding on similar types of food. So yeah, that's one of the examples of fossil oilbirds that have been discovered, and there are some other ones that are not as well known from Europe.
And of course, it ain't a Green River fossil unless there's little fishes.
Right? Yes, yes. You might have noticed that around the skeleton there are some other animals that have been preserved with it, and these are little fish that are very common in the Green River Formation. Yep.
So funny.
All right. On the next slide, we get to another group of today mostly South American group of Strisorians. These are the Potoos. And yeah, so they're known from the Neotropics, although as we shall see, there are stem Potoos known from Europe. So again, once they had a much wider distribution. Now, there are only 7 living species of Potoo, and again, they are another one of the nocturnal groups. So you can see in this picture here that they have really big eyes. During the day, what they do is they'll perch on tree branches and kind of tip their head up and then close their eyes. And in this kind of posture, they look a lot like kind of a broken branch or a dead tree branch. And so this, allows them to camouflage themselves very well. Now, interestingly, they have these little slits in their eyelids, so even when they're kind of in this sleeping posture with their eyes closed, they can actually still see around them, which is kind of wild. So if you get too close to them, they will react. Like they might kind of they'll stick it out for as long as they can, but if they think they're in danger of being spotted, what they might do is they'll often like kind of suddenly open their eyes and open their mouths, and we talked about how they have these really big eyes, and they have these very broad kind of short bills, so suddenly kind of opening their mouths and eyes like that, is a pretty striking display that hopefully can scare off a predator.
The musket birds.
Yeah. There are quite a few internet memes that feature Potoos because of their very unusual kind of appearance. I think Darren Naish blogged about this at one point where he was talking about Potoos as an internet meme. They are very unusual looking. Fortunately, they're not dangerous to people. They can't really hurt you or anything. Now that's what they do during the day. At night, what they do is they'll usually keep perched, but they will catch insects by flying at them from the perch. So they'll watch for insects coming by, and then they'll fly out and grab the insects in midair if they see something tasty. So that's how they hunt. But there's quite a bit we don't really know about Potoos, because again, nocturnal, hard to study. Mostly they're pretty well studied in terms of their distribution, because they do make these very loud calls at night, so they're there. If you go out in the field in the rainforest at night, you can hear them. But in terms of like their actual behavior, what they're doing, things like that, it's not super well studied. So they're still a relatively mysterious group of birds. Do you have anything else to add about them?
Well, I'll just mention this. So I always have to remember this when I'm looking up different animals.
Uh-huh.
These aren't to be confused with Potoos,
Oh, right.
which are primates.
Yes.
In the bush baby group.
Right.
From Africa.
That's right.
I'm trying to search for them. Like, am I spelling this right? I forget. Put an O, and then I'm looking up birds. I'm like, oh, whoops, this is the other one.
Right. Yeah. If it's 3 O's, it's a bird. If it's 2 T's, it's a primate, basically. Yeah, it's like Potoos are the bird and Potoos are the primate. Yeah. Those are some really weird primates too. But yeah, anyways, yeah, no, I don't want to get too distracted.
Right.
Yeah. So very similar names for 2 very unusual groups of animals. So on the next slide, I have shown probably the best known. I think I think this genus is the only confirmed or well corroborated member of the stem Potoo lineage, but Paraprofika, um, and it was named for its similarity to Profica, which we saw earlier. Um, but however, Profica is a stem oilbird, whereas Paraprofica is a stem Potoo. And since it is known from the Messel, it is known from some pretty well preserved specimens, as you can see here. You can see that even the feathers are preserved in this specimen, and a good number of specimens are known of Paraprofica. Um, two species have been named, so I think this is the better known one, Profica kelleri, known from better preserved specimens. But there's another one that's slightly bigger called a Paraprofica major. Um, no, no points for guessing why it's named that. But yeah, so we do have these pretty good fossils of these early Potoos, and they're pretty similar to the modern Potoos, like in a lot of ways. There are some minor differences in the skeleton, but overall they look pretty similar. So probably they were doing pretty similar things. All right, let's go to the next group. Right, so the next group are the Frogmouths. And so this group, again, is also known from fossils from the Eocene. And even though in modern day they are restricted to Australasia and parts of continental Asia, so southern Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, in the fossil record they are known from Europe, and there is a possible one from North America, which we will see a bit later. So this group, kind of like the Potoos, they also during the day tend to spend their time camouflaged in the trees. So they also have a very similar kind of concealment posture where they'll tip their head up and close their eyes, and so they kind of pretend to be a dead branch. And then they, during the nighttime that they come out and hunt. Now, the frogmouths include the largest living members of Strisores, and they also have a beak that is a lot more robust than that of other members of Strisores. So on the first slide, other than the title slide, I pointed out how the beak is a lot longer in the frogmouth than in the other members of Strisores, and it is also a lot more robust. Yeah, so I mentioned how some of the members of Strisores have skulls that are super, super thin, but in a frogmouth, I've looked at a frogmouth skull, and it is a lot more solidly built. So they have a much more robust beak, and because of this, they are actually able to hunt other vertebrates a lot more frequently than the other members of Strisores. So the larger members of frogmouths, larger frogmouths, they will actually go after things like frogs and lizards and rodents and other small mammals. So they're not just insect eaters. And unlike most of the other members of Strisores, they don't really catch their prey in midair. Like for a long time, people assumed that they did because they're otherwise somewhat similar to the other members of the group. They have these broad skulls and they eat insects and stuff, so people assume that they must have hunted in the same way. But they don't really catch prey in midair like the others do. What they prefer to do is they'll watch from a perch, and then they'll suddenly jump down and grab the prey inside their beak, usually on the ground or maybe lower down on the tree or something like that. If it's an especially large prey item, they'll usually beat the prey against like a branch or something to kill it before they swallow it. If it's a smaller prey item, they'll just swallow it right away.
It's a typical bird thing, it seems.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I think kind of related to this is that frogmouths are often confused for owls. But yeah, they're not owls. Owls catch prey with their feet, whereas frogmouths are very, very beak dominant hunters. If you look at a frogmouth skeleton, you'll see like how much of the skeleton is taken up by its head. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. Like they have a massive head compared to the rest of the skeleton.
Yeah, kind of like a frog.
Right, exactly. So they are very well named.
You know, the owl thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, like of course, I'm sure a lot of you who grew up with animal books will know, like for a long time, owls and the nocturnal members of Strisores were thought to have something to do with each other.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I might as well mention it now. Yeah, exactly. It was thought for a long time that the owls and the nocturnal members of Strisores close relatives. It turns out they're not. They're not closely related at all with the Neoaves. We will get to owls much later in this series. They are more closely related to the diurnal birds of prey, the songbirds and parrots, and the woodpeckers and kingfishers. So they are members of Teleraves, the Corland bird group, whereas Strisores is distinct and generally not found to be closely related to Teleraves in most of the recent analyses. So yeah, it turns out that their nocturnal habits, entirely convergent. They're not closely related. So on the next slide, we can see an example of a fossil frogmouth, a stem frogmouth at least. So this is a Podargus, also from the Messel of Germany. And you can see here like how big that head is. Like in the top right, you can see that's where its head is. And you can see how that huge beak. Yeah, look at how big it is compared to the rest of the skeleton. Like this is not it's not entirely complete in terms of the skeletal completeness, but most of the skeleton is there. You can see the wings and you can see one of the legs and most of the body, and yeah, the head is huge. So Podargus, again, was probably doing things pretty similarly to the modern frogmouths. Now on the next slide is a possible stem frogmouth called Fluvioviridavus. So when this bird was first described, people didn't really know what to make of it because it's got all these very weird and unusual features, and so they were like, it's some kind of land bird, I guess. Very specific. Later on, some people suggested, there are some similarities to Strisores, maybe it's a member of that group. And then later in 2011, Sterling Nesbitt et al. Did a rather detailed paper trying to determine its phylogenetic placement, and they found that in their results, they found it supported as a stem frogmouth. Now, interestingly, Sterling Nesbitt is probably better known for his work on Triassic reptiles, but here he decided to work on a Cenozoic one, so and a bird at that. So kind of interesting chapter in his research history. But in any case, that was a very reasonable hypothesis. The Fluvioviridavus does have a very frogmouth-like skull, and you can see that here. You can see again in the top right. You can see the beak, and you can probably tell it's very frogmouth-like. It's large and it's kind of long, but also broad and takes up a lot of the skull. However, other researchers were skeptical about this. So Gerald Meyer, who is a very preeminent fossil bird expert, he pointed out a number of features in Fluvioviridavus that are more similar to the oilbird. So, for example, the foot of Fluvioviridavus is very short, and you can see it in the hind limbs here. So, the first bone in the hind limb is the thigh bone, the femur. The next one down is the shin. So, in birds, it's called the tibiotarsus. And then the next one down is called the tarsometatarsus, which is basically the equivalent of the sole of the foot. And in Fluvioviridavus, it is extremely short, which is similar not to frogmouths, but it is similar to oilbird and also incidentally to Potoos. That might come in, might be significant later. Anyways, yes, so it has a short foot like oilbird, and also it has a larger number of vertebrae compared to other members of Strisores. So most members of Strisores have a relatively low number of vertebrae by bird standards, except for the oilbird. And so Gerald Meyer argued that this probably wasn't a stem frogmouth. Now, in the paper I did with my co-authors on the phylogeny of Strisores, we included Fluvioviridavus in our analyses, and it turns out that in our analyses, when we include both genetic and morphological data, Fluvioviridavus comes out as a stem oilbird instead of a stem frogmouth. So, kind of its position is still somewhat unresolved, I guess, or disputed at least. I won't deny that it does have a lot of similarities in its skull to frogmouths, but at the same time, I think it's kind of Oilbird similarities are potentially somewhat telling as well. So I guess it'll take hopefully future research can resolve this. But in my paper at least, we argued that it was more likely a stem oilbird. Um, I guess incidentally, Fluvioviridavis is from the Green River Formation, and its name actually means Green River Bird. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about it. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
All right. So yeah, kind of a mystery fossil for future researchers to puzzle over. But at least we no longer consider it indeterminate land bird. So that's an improvement, right? All right. The next group, a living group, is the Owlet-nightjars. So these are not the same thing as the nightjars. Um, This is a group that is only found in Australasia, specifically in Australia and New Guinea, and until recently, New Zealand as well. There are around 10 living species, although give or take a few, depending on how much of a splitter you are. Now, the fossil record of owlet-nightjars is not as good as the others. Stem owlet-nightjars are only known for sure from the Miocene onwards. Although in the study that I did, we did find an Eocene fossil that might be a stem owlet-nightjar. It's called Hassievis. It's also from the Meso. It's known from a couple of very well preserved specimens, and they do have some similarities to owlet-nightjars, although we found that the support for this was somewhat weak, so we can't really be sure about that, but it is possible. And owlet-nightjars are nocturnal. In fact, they like to be active in pretty much the dead of night when it's really, really dark. And it's probably because they are pretty small-bodied birds, so they're quite vulnerable to predators. So they like to be out and about when it's as dark as possible, and they can't be seen basically. Now, in terms of their foraging habits, they like a lot of the other members of Strisores, especially the Potoos. They'll often watch for insects from a perch and then fly out and grab them in midair. But they also hunt quite a bit on the ground, as it turns out, which is pretty unusual. Yeah, they'll actually like kind of run around on the ground and grab insects from the ground. In fact, I've seen on Twitter people who do field work in Australia, like biologists who do field work, when they set traps for like ground-dwelling mammals, like they're trying to catch small mammals running around on the ground. I've seen people say and tweet about it and tweet photos of the fact that it is not uncommon for them to catch owlet-nightjars in these ground traps, which is, yeah, pretty interesting. So yeah,
Well, I guess to be able to hunt on the ground, they must have well-developed legs then.
yeah, and you can kind of see this in the photo here that their legs are not that short, like they're reasonably long for this group of birds. And in fact, there was a recently extinct species that probably died out in historic times that lived on New Zealand, and its skeleton has features that indicate, like it has reduced wings and all that indicate it had reduced flight capabilities. It might have still been able to fly a little bit, like it still has like a keel on the sternum to attach flight muscles, but it might not have been a very good flyer. And it probably went extinct. Like the youngest remains of it that have been found and dated. Um, they date to shortly before humans arrived on New Zealand. Um, it is thought that they might have gone extinct when Pacific rats were introduced to New Zealand, with rats on the ships of humans traveling around might have made their way to New Zealand a bit earlier than humans actually did. And so probably having these rats on the island threatened these ground-dwelling birds, especially relatively small-bodied ones like these, and so they might have gone extinct at that point. However, there are these anecdotal records of these small nocturnal owl-like birds, all the way into relatively recent history. So some people have argued that maybe in some pockets of New Zealand, this extinct New Zealand owlet-nightjar still lived until very recent times. But for most part, the evidence seems to indicate a much earlier extinction date. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add about this group?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the New Zealand species a lot now.
Oh yeah,
It's a,
yeah, it's a really curious species. I would love to know more about it. Um, it turns out a lot of its remains are found in kind of these accumulations where owls would throw up their pellets. So it got eaten a lot by owls, basically.
oh wow.
Yeah, yeah. So, other than that, Owlet-nightjars are not especially well studied. So, probably the best studied species is the one that's found in Australia proper, so the Australian owlet-nightjar, as it's appropriately named. Most of the other living species are found in New Guinea. So, as you can see, New Guinea has a very diverse array of owlet-nightjars, but most of them are not very well studied. And again, we talked about this. They're nocturnal. They're hard to study. And
Right.
again, New Guinea, a lot of areas of New Guinea are pretty remote, so that probably doesn't help matters in that regard.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating place.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, New Guinea is a real hotspot of biodiversity, and we'll probably revisit it at some point later in this series. All right, so let's go to the next group. All right, so next group we get to Apodiformes. So Apodiformes is a group that unites hummingbirds and swifts. And this group is even more diverse than the nocturnal members of Strisores. There are over 400 living species of Apodiforms. And, looking at a hummingbird and a swift, you might think they're pretty different. And of course, they are different in a lot of ways. But it actually wasn't too difficult for people to figure out that they're closely related. Um, so here I've pictured kind of a schematic showing the wing shape of these two different groups, the swifts and the hummingbirds. And you can see that, relatively, swifts have much longer wing feathers, whereas hummingbirds have relatively shorter wing feathers. But if you look under the feathers and look at their wing skeleton, it turns out their wing skeleton is actually quite similar between these two groups. And especially the upper arm bone, the one closest to the shoulder joint, is very very unusual in both swifts and hummingbirds. They have these very very short and stumpy upper arm bones, and I pictured a few in the lower image here. These are upper arm bones of two swifts on the left, and then a tree swift, which is a close relative of the true swifts, on the right. Um, Yeah, so they have these super weird and stumpy upper arm bones. In a hummingbird, they're even weirder than this. They have these extremely exaggerated kind of bumps, and you can see this to a degree in the swifts too. They have all these exaggerated bumps on the upper arm bone for wing muscle attachment. So both hummingbirds and swifts are very skilled flyers in their own separate ways, and kind of this very short arm bone allows them to make the complex wing movements to do this. Now, the out of all the members of Strisores that are alive today, um, the Apodiforms are the only diurnal members of this group. So we mentioned that earlier. And the tree swifts and the swifts are notable for having these very, very long wing feathers. And you can see that, the wing feathers towards the tip of the wing are pretty much longer than the entire arm. So, yeah, pretty wild. Right. So, do you have anything else to add about this group? Well,
I was
we'll
gonna
get
ask.
into like swifts and hummingbirds specifically in a bit.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. Apodiformes. That's basically forms without feet, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So it's named after the genus Apus, a genus of swifts, which means no feet, and that's because the members of this group, both the hummingbirds and the swifts, have rather short hind limbs. Um, Part of that is they're just so aerially adapted that they just spend a lot of time in the air and don't really need their feet for much other than to cling onto surfaces. Well, hummingbirds they will perch, but as we shall see when we get to the swifts don't really use their feet for all that much other than clinging.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so that's why they have the name Apodiformes. That's right. Okay, so let's get to know how the specific groups of Apodiforms. So first up, we have the tree swifts. This is A group that is much less diverse than the swifts and the hummingbirds, as we shall see. There's only 4 living species that have been named. There isn't really a well-supported fossil record for this group as of yet. There are no definite stem tree swifts that have been identified in the fossil record, so we're still looking for those. And currently they're only found in southern and Southeast Asia. They are unlike true swifts in that they like to perch in trees. As we shall see, the true swifts don't perch in trees much, if at all. And the tree swifts will also nest in trees. And what they will do is they will build this nest not on top of a branch, like you would expect of a normal bird. What they will do is they will build a nest on the side of a branch. And what they do is they will stick the nest to the side of the branch using their saliva. So they have these really well-developed saliva glands that they will use to produce lots and lots of sticky saliva that they use to glue their nest to branches. Very weird. And as we will see, the swifts also often use their saliva in nest building as well. But yeah, other than that, this is not a very well studied group, so there's probably not a lot that we know about them as of yet. They're similar to the true swifts in a lot of ways, other than being more perchy and a bit less aerial. Although they do have very long wing feathers, so they are skilled flyers nonetheless. But yeah, other than that, we don't know too much about them. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I'd love to. I hope we could get more information about these in the near future. I mean,
Yeah.
they're certainly pretty looking birds, and yeah, I don't really hear about them all that much.
No, not really. Yeah, and I agree. I definitely look forward to finding out more about them. And yes, they are pretty. They are very pretty. Um, a lot of them have these very bold facial markings, as you can see in this whiskered tree swift, and many of them have this nice kind of iridescent green coloration for most of their backside. So that is yeah, very very striking looking birds.
That's cool.
Yeah. Now the true swifts on the next slide are to a degree much better studied, and part of this because they are much more diverse. There are over 100 living species, and they can be found pretty much worldwide except for Antarctica. So yeah, very wide-ranging group. However, they are hard to study in their own way, and that's because they are very, very aerial. And like we kind of admire birds for being able to fly, and in some ways, the master of being able to fly in the bird world are the swifts. The swifts spend most of their lives in the air, and it's not just that they fly around all day and then retire. Well, some of them do that, but a lot of them they spend many, many, many days or even months just continuously in the air without landing.
They must ride the thermals then.
Oh, they can do that, yeah, but they're also very good at flapping flight as well. So this was suspected for a long time. People thought we never see these swifts when they're not breeding. We never see them land. We never see the non-breeding swifts land at all. So maybe they just spend all their time flying. And it turns out relatively recently, we were finally able to put little tracking devices on swifts, and these confirmed that during non-breeding season, at least a common swift just stays in the air pretty much all the time, up to about 10 months in a year even. So, and then yeah, they just spend all day and all the time in the air, and then it's only when they fly to their breeding grounds that they finally have to land in order to nest. So speaking of landing, swifts don't really perch in trees like other birds do. In fact, a good way to distinguish them from swallows. So swallows, right? Yeah, swallows are similar to swifts in terms of their ecology. So they're also very aerial, very agile birds that fly around and catch insects in the air. Swifts and swallows are not closely related. Swallows are not members of Strisores. Swallows are a kind of songbird, and we won't get to songbirds until much later. But they are similar in their ecologies. However, you can tell them apart in the field if you know what to look for. And one of the easiest ways to look for to tell them apart is that if you see one of these very aerial swallow-like birds land on a branch or something and perch, then it's probably a swallow and not a swift, because swifts usually will not do that.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know definitely growing up, I had children's books about animals where they put swifts and swallows
Oh
together.
yeah.
It's to be like, well, they're different birds, and here's why, even though they look
Right,
similar.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even when I'm out, when I'm outside and I see really small, swiftly flying birds in the air,
Mhm.
I often wonder, like, am I looking at a chimney swift, or am I
Right.
looking at one of the many swallows that we have? And I usually have to like look at the wings and the colors
Right.
on the wings to be sure.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, so do you see chimney swift often?
Occasionally, yeah,
Yeah.
they kind of have little congregations as they go by.
That's really cool. Yeah, right. So, indeed, like you kind of alluded to, yeah, one of the other ways, if you, waiting around for a while and they never perch, well, what do you do then? One of the easiest ways would be to look at the wing shape. So, the swifts, as you can see very well in the photograph here, have these very long and narrow, kind of sickle-shaped wings, whereas the wings of swallows tend to be a lot more triangular and a bit broader. So that's a very good way to tell them apart. Um, the way they kind of fly also tends to be a bit different. So in field guides, they often describe the flight style of swifts as being a twinkling flight. I guess it's a bit hard to imagine if you don't look at them much in the field, but you can kind of see what they mean when you actually pay close attention to a swift flying. It's that they kind of hold their wings very stiffly, um, and so they'll kind of when they're flying, they kind of snap their wings very quickly a few times, and then kind of glide a bit, and that's how that's the way they fly. Whereas the swallows kind of do something very differently. They kind of flap a lot more fluidly than swifts do. So that's another way you can try to tell them apart. And next time you see one of these insect catching birds up high in the sky, pay some close attention. You might be able to see what that means.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, let's see. So let's see. I mentioned that they don't perch and stuff, right? So I was going to talk about what they actually do when they land. Um, so what swifts prefer to do when they do land is that they prefer to cling to vertical surfaces, and so this is the reason why chimney swifts are called chimney swifts because they have taken a liking to roosting and nesting inside chimneys. And so, yeah, they'll cling to the inside of chimneys, many of them at a time. They're pretty social. They'll roost together. Um, so the feet, as we kind of mentioned earlier, of swifts are very unusual. So they're pretty short. They're not good for walking at all. Um, so pretty much all birds have, or at least most modern birds have three toes pointing forward and one pointing back, and swifts do as well. But the forward pointing toes are all roughly equal in length, and all the toes have very, very long claws on them. So this makes these feet very good for clinging to surfaces, but they're a bit unwieldy for perching on objects, for actually gripping things. So that's probably why they don't like to perch very much. Now there is this kind of myth about swifts. Yeah, I guess because they are so weird and kind of capture our imagination so much. A number of myths have arisen about swifts, and one of these is that their feet are very weak, and they don't do anything with them. Um, well, that's not entirely true. Um, so the I mentioned that their claws are actually very well developed. So even though they can't really walk with their feet, they're actually able to cling very strongly to surfaces with their feet. And in fact, I've seen a video um, of a swift that managed to put a starling in a hospital. Uh, okay, so what I mean by that is that it basically injured the starling to the point starling had to be taken to a wildlife rehabber to be nursed back to health.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and the way the swift managed to do that was by clinging to the starling with its feet, with its very, very long claws, and it just hung on there um, until someone was able to separate them. Um, eh, yeah,
Oh my
I
goodness.
Yeah, I gotta say, like, if I had to guess what bird could put a starling in hospital, I would not have guessed swift at all. Because a starling, at least a European starling, is a very solidly built, very aggressive bird. One of the reasons that they are invasive in North America is that they are so aggressive. They chase away a lot of the other birds that use tree hollows as nesting sites, and they're able to very able to back this up. They're very muscular. They can kill similar size or smaller birds pretty easily, um, and they are certainly quite a bit bigger than the common swift. So I was very surprised to see a video of that.
Yeah, that's like the most extreme way to say my feet aren't weak.
Right, right. Yes. I kind of related to this is that in a lot of books, they'll say that swifts have these what they call pamprodactyl feet. So pamprodactyl means that all of the toes face forwards and none of them face backwards. And people say, oh, because they have pamprodactyl feet, they can't perch, and so that's why they cling to things. It turns out that this is not entirely true, though it used to be thought that this was the case. But then people decided to take actually a closer look at swift feet, and it turns out that they actually do have the normal kind of foot arrangement in that we see in most other birds. However, there are some species of swifts that are able to. What they do is they're able to grasp objects by pinching them between the inner two toes and the outer two toes. So whereas in a normal bird, they grip them kind of with the reversed first toe and then grip it between that toe and the forward facing toes. Some swifts are able to grip things kind of between the toes instead, like kind of lengthwise along the foot, which is very odd. And that's kind of another way that they cling to vertical surfaces. And when they do this, if they kind of feel themselves kind of losing their grip, they are able to kind of swivel the first toe forward a bit to kind of improve the grip. And so because of this, they can sort of adopt a pamprodactyl posture, but most of the time this is actually not normal for swifts. So yeah, they actually do not have a unusual kind of toe arrangement compared to other birds. Um, I guess somewhat related to this is that it is often said that swifts cannot take off from the ground. Um, well, it is true that they have trouble doing it, and this is because the problem with taking off, the kind of the issue with taking off from the ground, it's not that it's because it's much harder to take off from the ground compared to from a branch or whatever. It turns out that birds that take off from a perch or from the ground are using pretty much the same mechanics. They're jumping off the surface and lifting off afterward. The tricky thing about taking off from the ground is that if you have very long wings, it's hard to jump high enough to clear your wings, to get enough space for your wings to do that first flapping motion to continue onwards into flight. Um, and so, because swifts have very long wings, it can take them a few tries before they're able to take off from a flat surface. Um, because they have to be able to clear enough height to be able to flap their wings. But they actually are capable of taking off from the ground. And if you don't believe me, I have seen video of this, and I will link one in the description. They are able to take off from the ground. Of course, they don't like doing it, so you're probably not gonna see a swift on the ground unless it's had an accident or if it's sick or something. So if you do see one on the ground, you should probably call a wildlife rehabber or something and take a look. But if by chance they do manage and they do find themselves on the ground and it is a healthy adult swift, they actually are usually able to get out of it.
It's like
Um,
not so much they can't do it; it's just they'd rather not.
yeah, right. Yeah, and who can blame them, right? Like if you can fly like a swift, why would you ever want to come down on the ground?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like I'm thinking about these birds. It's like you kind of wonder, like what. Obviously, there are no, there's no directions in evolution or anything
Right,
like
right.
that. Whatever happens, happens. It's just I wonder what it would take for a bird like this to just stay in the air indefinitely.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
breeding, all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think the the main constraint is almost certainly breeding, because I guess birds haven't really figured out a way to internalize their eggs. Yeah, so even the most extremely marine adapted birds, or the most aerial birds, in this case the swifts, have not really evolved any way to be able to stay in the stay away from landing, or being to some extent connected to the ground, I guess, in some way, because
Right.
they need to lay their eggs somewhere. Um, yeah, and so yeah, it would be interesting to know, if you didn't have this constraint, could you evolve like a completely aerial bird that just never lands ever, ever, ever? It's
I'm,
a
I'm trying to go through the animal kingdom. I'm like, are there any animals that
I
do
did
that?
I don't know. Like, are there any insects that just stay in the air for forever? Like, in theory, I could see it happening, but I don't know if there actually are any.
Right, because I know that there's such a thing as air plankton.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, masses of little creatures that just ride the currents.
Hmm.
That's how spiders are able to get everywhere.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's the same point you brought up. Like, if there was a way for these insects or what have you to breed without coming onto the ground,
Hmm.
then I suppose it's possible.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if there are any, but I I guess I wouldn't be super surprised if there were insects that did it.
Right. Maybe
Yeah,
like the opposite of like the open ocean situation, where you have animals that are
right.
just there in the water column and they don't really go to the
Yeah,
seabed or anything.
right, right. Exactly, exactly. So yeah, the air is kind of its own ecosystem in some ways, and definitely swifts are, I guess, in some ways the apex predators of that ecosystem. Now they do get hunted by birds of prey and things, but as you might imagine, swifts are not that easy to catch. Very agile flyers and very fast flyers. It's kind of in the name. They're swifts. um, yeah, they are some of the fastest recorded birds in level flight. There is a very oft repeated statistic that I think one of the spine-tailed swifts, or the needle-tailed swifts is able to fly at something ridiculous like 170 kilometers an hour or something. Um, I think that's considered kind of apocryphal. Like, no one has been able to properly like verify it, but at the same time, it's like they clearly are able to go very very fast. Um, I think the fastest confirmed record is something like 110 kilometers in a common swift or something, which is plenty fast.
I think like, in the end, like I do understand it's difficult to actually like measure
Yeah,
animal speeds.
right, right, exactly, for sure, especially flying animals. So yeah,
So that's cool.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Right. So speaking of kind of breeding habits, so again, they nest on vertical surfaces, the same ones they cling to, um, and a lot of them will incorporate saliva as their nesting material. So they'll use their again sticky saliva to kind of bind their nest together and stick them onto the surface that they're nesting on. In fact, there are a few species of cave living species, um, cave living swifts, where they will make their nests entirely out of their saliva. So yeah, their nests are just solid masses of their spit just kind of bound together into the shape of a nest. Really weird. In the areas where these swifts are found, their nests are actually considered a delicacy. So if you've ever heard of bird's nest soup, uh, that that's a type of food that's made out of the nests of these swifts. Um, these these cave dwelling swifts, they will also use echolocation, like the oilbird that I mentioned earlier. So along with the oilbird, these are the only confirmed uh, examples of echolocating birds that we know of. So that is quite unusual.
Yeah.
I guess if you're wondering, how do they sleep when they're just flying for months at a time? It is thought that they probably kind of shut down half their brains at a time while they're sleeping. Um, so yeah, they'll keep one half awake so they can continue to fly while um, give the other half some rest. And I'm not sure if this has actually been confirmed in Swifts or if it's just suspected, but um, there doesn't seem to be any other way that they would be able to sleep and fight, so it seems likely, and it definitely has been confirmed in other types of birds. So, yeah, seems like the
Like
most plausible mechanism.
whales do that, don't
Hmm.
they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the whales will do that where they shut off half their brain so they can continue to kind of rise to the surface and breathe. Um, yeah, while they get some rest. Indeed. All right, let's see. So on the next slide, I have a fossil of a stem swift, and this is Scania subsellus. So Scania subsellus is known from two species, and one of them is from the Messel in Germany. And as you can see, it is known from some very well-preserved specimens. I mean, just look at this fossil with the feathers preserved.
Yeah,
And
beautiful.
yeah, and you can see that the swift-like shape is just unmistakable. Like, look at those wings. Those are a swift's wings. You can't really mistake that for anything else. Um, yeah. So as far back as the Eocene, swifts were, doing what swifts do. Now, um, it is worth pointing out that the hind limbs of Eosipsalus are actually more similar to those of tree swifts than those of true swifts. So probably Scania subsellus was doing more of a tree swift like thing where it was perching in trees and probably not spending as much time in the air. But even so, you can easily see from this that they were well on their way there at that point. All right, let's see. Do you have anything else to mention?
Nope.
Alrighty, then let's get to the hummingbirds, which I think is a group that probably a lot of people have been waiting for, because they are
Oh, I love these.
these are just one of some of the most remarkable birds, like some of the most remarkable dinosaurs and some of the most remarkable reptiles. I mean, sorry to herpetologists, but come on, hummingbirds, you can't not love them. So yes, hummingbirds, surprisingly enough, have a pretty decent fossil record. We will see a few examples a bit later. Um, there are over 300 living species, which I think is more than all the other members of Strisores combined. So they are super diverse. And today, hummingbirds are only known from the Americas. However, their fossil record is pretty good in Europe, as it turns out. Very odd. Um, Now, I have known people who, are not from the Americas, people who live in, say, Asia or Europe, who claim to have seen wild hummingbirds. And I must say that is very unlikely, but there are some possible sources of confusion. So there's a group of day flying moths. What are they called? Like I think some people just call them hummingbird moths, but oh yeah, sphinx moths are
Hmm.
their other name, which can be extremely hummingbird-like. So they have a very long, what we call proboscis, which they use for extracting nectar, and they also kind of beat their wings super fast, and they can, be pretty decently sized. Like they can overlap in size with some hummingbirds. So, I understand, people seeing sphinx moth might mistake them for hummingbirds because they can look very hummingbird-like. And in some parts of the old world, especially in the tropics, there's also a group of songbirds called the sunbirds. Um, and the sunbirds are another group of nectar feeding birds. And unlike the hummingbirds, they prefer to feed from a perch. So instead of hovering, they tend to perch on the kind of the side of a branch, the side of a plant, and then stick their beaks into the flower nearby. Although some of them, at least some of them, are able to hover, and they do hover when they're feeding. Um, in some cases. So that's another possible group that might be confused with hummingbirds. But otherwise, you want honest to goodness hummingbirds, you have to go to the Americas nowadays. So, I know you have some interesting experiences with hummingbirds, right?
Oh yeah. The ruby-throated
Hmm.
hummingbirds, like the one on the East Coast
That's
that
right.
everyone knows, and I've seen them quite a bit over the years. Not too long ago, we started actually, finding good hummingbird feeders and putting them in the
Mm,
yard to
yeah.
encourage them to come. And well, for them, they're very resourceful. Like within less than 20 minutes or so of putting a feeder up and getting it all prepared, they just show up,
Yeah.
and they're very they're very easy to tell because little hovering green thing coming here and there, like clearly a hummingbird,
Yeah.
and yeah, they're fun to watch, and I know they're very testy when they want to be.
Yes,
I'm sure
indeed.
you'll explain in a moment.
Right.
I have been sized up by a hummingbird
Wow.
before. It was a male, I could certainly tell by the
Right, right.
um, and I was just because I was sitting. We have a little bench next to our trees and where we put the hummingbird feeder, so we can
Mhm.
get like a good view of them
Yeah,
without
yeah.
just. And I was just sitting, reading, and just looking at all the animals, and one of these hummingbirds showed up, and he was kind of hovering in front of me,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and I can see he's kind of like going back and forth in my direction,
Right.
kind of like like, as if he's like, whatever you're thinking about, stop it right now. This is my turf. You think you're better than me? I'm just watching you. And then he went on his feet and he flew away, and that always cracks.
That is amazing. Yeah, they are very bold, and they tend to be very unafraid of things because if you can fly like a hummingbird, it's very hard to catch you. um, so yes, hummingbirds famously include the smallest known birds. So the smallest known species on record is the bee hummingbird from Cuba, which weighs between 1 and 2 grams, which is ridiculous.
Pretty much like the size of a bee.
Right, right. Well named. In my childhood books, they would often have a photo of a bee hummingbird perched on a pencil, and so you can see how small it is. um, and the cliche is that their eggs are the size of jelly beans. So yeah, tiny, tiny, tiny little birds. Um, so that also makes them the smallest known dinosaurs and the smallest known archosaurs. They're not the smallest known reptiles because there are lizards that get smaller than they are, which is
Oh,
which is crazy. But yeah, even so, yeah, it's kind of wild what evolution can do. Um, but in any case, yes, tiny, tiny little dinosaurs. So kind of I guess I don't want to say famously, but it kind of struck a chord with a lot of people at TetsuCon when I one year I was invited to give a talk at TetsuCon. Um,
woohoo!
yeah, yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. Um, so if you're not familiar, TetsuCon is a zoology convention run by paleontologist Darren Naish, and every year he basically invites a bunch of very interesting speakers. Uh, to speak about all kinds of aspects of a tetrapod zoology, which is what the con stands for. Um, and yeah, it's always a super fun time. And anyways, yeah. So one year I gave a talk at TetsuCon and I mentioned, a hummingbird is basically a dinosaur trying to be a butterfly. And I think that's a very apt kind of analogy. And a lot of people kind of took a liking to that and started tweeting about it repeatedly. So that was fun.
Aw.
But yeah, in any case, I think that's a very pretty good summation of what hummingbirds kind of are. Um, so they have become very specialized to feed on nectar. So unlike the other members of Strisores, they have this very long and narrow bill. However, nectar is very, very sugar rich, but you don't really get much protein from it. So they will actually still feed on insects. Um, in fact, insects are a very important part of their diet because of this. So that raises kind of a problem, right? Because a hummingbird doesn't have a beak like a typical Strisorian does anymore. So how are you going to catch an insect with basically, a pair of chopsticks? Like, try and catch a fly with a pair of chopsticks. It's very hard. Um, you don't really have an insect net anymore for a bill. So hummingbirds have kind of sort of compensated for this in a very interesting way. And what they'll do is when they're hunting for insects, um, they are able to bend their lower jaw, not just at the jaw joint where the mouth opens, but they're able to bend the lower jaw kind of midway along its length. So, what they will do is they will use this kind of joint in the middle of the jaw to bend the entire lower jaw downwards. And so when the lower jaw is bent out of the way like this, they can use the base of the bill, which is broader than the kind of the long and narrow tips, to scoop up insects. And so yeah, they'll do this. They'll bend the lower jaw of the way, and then fly after insects and catch them like a swift would. So yeah, that's how they catch insects. Pretty cool.
That's so interesting. Are there any other birds that can bend their bill like that?
To an extent, yeah. A lot of the other members of Strisores actually sort of have a mobile lower jaw like that, and what they do with it is that it makes their jaw even wider, as if they needed that, right? It makes their lower jaw even wider when they want to catch something. Yeah, there are some other birds where the upper jaw is bendy like that. So a lot of the sandpipers can do this thing where the upper jaw is able to bend independently of the rest of the skull, kind of midway down its length. And what that helps them to do is when they're kind of probing for food in the ground, they can kind of open their jaw in that narrow space because they can bend the upper jaw, midway down its length and grab the whatever food item they're going after. Anyways, I guess we'll probably go into that when we get to the shorebirds.
Oh,
But
sure.
yeah, the birds have evolved all kinds of weird mobility of the mouth. Yeah, we are much more limited by comparison. But yes, so that's how they catch insects. As for how they obtain nectar, hummingbirds, um, they do this with a very long tongue. And so, yeah, they'll stick their long bill inside a plant or inside a flower. A lot of flowers that depend on hummingbirds for pollination have evolved these very, very long tubes. And what this basically does is it only allows hummingbirds to access the nectar because that the hummingbird will reliably go to a plant of the same species, which with this very similar tube to feed on, where other nectar feeding animals are less likely to compete with it, and bring the pollen there. And so kind of plants have kind of taken advantage of this and co-evolved with hummingbirds in this regard. And so it sticks its bill inside the tube, and then it sticks out its tongue further to reach even further. And for a long time, it was thought that the way hummingbirds were able to lap up nectar with their tongue was through a kind of a process called capillary action. And capillary action is basically when a fluid is inside a very, very narrow tube, it'll kind of automatically creep its way up in the inside of the tube. So yeah, it's a rather well-known physical phenomenon. And so the hummingbird's tongue kind of has these two grooves running along the top of it, and it was thought for a long time that these two grooves allowed the nectar to kind of climb up along its length using capillary action. But in recent times, people have taken another look at it and said, capillary action is pretty slow, and a hummingbird can, stick its tongue in and out of its mouth many, many times in a minute. Um,
Oh yeah, I've seen this too.
yeah. Right. So that's not nearly enough time for capillary action to take effect. So maybe something different is going on here. And so when people actually took, high-speed footage of hummingbirds feeding, they found that this was the case. They don't actually use capillary action to move the nectar up into their tongue. What they do is they use a kind of pumping mechanism. And so let me see if I can kind of explain this in a way that makes sense. Okay, so the the tip of a hummingbird's tongue is not like a straightforward, just a pointed kind of tip like you might imagine a tongue to be. It's actually kind of has kind of a frayed tip, almost like a brush, kind of. Very weird. And so um, what happens when a hummingbird sticks out its tongue is that when the tongue is being stuck out, um, it's because the beak is being held kind of shut, right? So the the tip of the tongue with its two grooves along the top and with the brush at the end is being kind of held compressed tightly when it's being stuck out. But once it's been stuck out into the flower, it's no longer being squeezed, compressed in this manner by the bill. So the tongue kind of springs into its kind of three-dimensional shape with the grooves and with the brush. And so the sudden kind of springing into shape kind of opens up a space to pull the nectar up onto the tongue. And so, and of course, the brush at the end kind of increases the surface area to do this. And so I've seen a hummingbird researcher describe this, or maybe it was a science journalist. Either way, it was an article on hummingbirds. Described this as being kind of a hummingbird is reaching out with a hand at the end of its tongue to grab the nectar with it. um, and so it's kind of more of a pumping mechanism because it suddenly opens up space and the fluid is pumped onto the tongue, and then the hummingbird retracts the tongue, um, and then when it sticks its tongue out for the next sip, it squeezes the nectar that was collected on the previous sip down into its throat, and then meanwhile compressing the tongue in preparation for the next round of nectar drinks. So that's basically a simple explanation of how it works. Pretty neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we didn't really understand this until pretty recently. Yeah, for a long time we were operating under the incorrect assumption. And
And
so,
show how much we're still learning about even living common animals today.
exactly, absolutely. And so, I guess on the next bullet point I have here, I mentioned that they are very aggressive, and you mentioned this earlier too. Um, yeah, so hummingbirds, because they need to eat, basically all the time, and when they're sleeping, they have to basically shut themselves down entirely in order to get a good night's rest, or else they would starve to death. So because of this, they are very protective of their food sources. And so, hummingbirds are very aggressive towards other hummingbirds, especially. So when they're not feeding, all the time they spend fighting each other. Yep. So they will go after each other, jabbing each other with their bills and things like that. Um, in fact, the Aztecs, they definitely knew about this because their god of war, one of his symbols was a hummingbird. Um,
Nice.
yeah. So yeah, I'm sure they were very familiar with hummingbird behavior because of that. It's very appropriate. Yep.
I'm sure I've seen this too. At least hummingbirds chasing after each other.
Yeah. I'm sure it's fairly common behavior. You definitely see if there's more than one hummingbird hanging around a feeder. It's quite likely to occur. Um, yeah. In fact, people have found that in some hummingbirds, uh, the males especially have bills that are specially adapted for fighting each other. So yeah, we think of a hummingbird bill as being mostly for feeding, but there are these some in some species the bill can be particularly sharp, so it has this particularly sharp tip uh, in the males for extra stabbiness, I guess technical term. And some of them even have these tooth-like projections along the inside of the bill, which apparently serve similar functions. So
Are
yes.
there recorded cases of like hummingbirds that they've found where they've just been injured by another?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know if there are any examples of like serious injuries occurring. Like, yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually read of any, but you would expect that it probably happens at some point, right? Given how aggressive they are and given their specialized weaponry in some species. Um, yeah, I would imagine in some cases they just fight so much they tire themselves out because they're kind of running on that knife edge all the time.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, thinking of hummingbirds, they're not so much Tinkerbell, but I've seen some people call them a dart, like an aim itself, and I think that's a more appropriate
Oh
analogy because yeah,
it's always the smallest things that are the toughest.
It's like chihuahuas.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, exactly. Now, another unusual thing about hummingbirds is that they are capable of vocal learning. Now, this is interesting because not that many animals are capable of this, but we are. And even if you never heard the term vocal learning before, you probably have an idea of what that means. We can learn new sounds by listening to them and then repeating them back. And furthermore, we can also combine, different sounds that we have learned to make kind of new sounds that mean different things. And so this is not a very common ability across all animals, but it is found in at least 3 different groups of birds. So these are the songbirds, the parrots, and the third group is the hummingbirds. The hummingbirds also learn some of their vocalizations. So instead of like knowing their vocalizations innately, they actually learn vocalizations from members of their own species by listening to them. And hummingbirds have some very elaborate kind of vocal displays. Now, a lot of their calls are very high pitched, so it can be quite difficult for us to hear them. But yeah, they are quite an important part of kind of hummingbird life. And so I have here that the males often have elaborate visual and acoustic displays. So I guess let's mention the visual part first. Hummingbirds often have these very brightly colored iridescent plumages, and you kind of see this in this Rivoli's hummingbird here. Look at the throat where it has this iridescent kind of bluish greenish patch right there, and definitely many hummingbirds have this kind of feature. So these very iridescent shiny structures. So a lot of times they are part of the mating display, but in addition to the visual component, they also often have an acoustic component. And I'm saying acoustic here and not just vocal, because yes, they often do have vocal calls that they use for courtship, but it has been found that in a number of hummingbird species, they don't just make sounds with their throat, basically. They will also sing with their feathers. And the way this works is they'll fly to a height and then they'll dive down very, very fast through the air. And then doing this, it causes the basically air to whistle through their tail feathers, and they have specialized feathers for this purpose. And it causes the feathers to create, a kind of a very distinctive noise that forms part of the mating display. So yeah, very cool. And doing these dives it's quite spectacular because relative to their body size, these hummingbirds can dive more quickly. They can dive faster than a peregrine falcon, which is in absolute terms the fastest diving kind of animal on Earth. And in fact, the hummingbirds can even dive faster relative to body size compared to a space shuttle re-entering the atmosphere or a fighter jet. So, yeah. Now, to be fair, it's kind of easier to do these things at a small body size to begin with, but even so, it's still pretty damn impressive.
Oh yeah.
And in fact, because what they do is they kind of dive down really quick and then they kind of pull up at the bottom of the dive very quickly. And when they're pulling up, they kind of experience G-forces greater than pretty much any other vertebrate does voluntarily, like except maybe fighter jet pilots. Like the number of G-forces they withstand during that pull-up phase are some like over I think over 8 Gs, which is for comparison I think over 7 Gs is enough for like a jet fighter pilot to black out if they keep up at it long enough. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have really strong adaptations in their skulls and in their brain.
Right. Yeah. It is speculated that they must have some very unusual adaptations for that. I guess it also helps that they don't sustain these G-forces for very long, and it's a fraction of a second. But even so, it's it's pretty incredible.
Oh, still impressive for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I guess we could talk about hummingbirds all day. There's so much spectacular and unusual features that they have. It would be very easy to do an entire lecture on just hummingbirds, or I'm sure someone could come up with an entire course on just hummingbirds, just applying hummingbirds to different concepts and things like that. Because there's just so much to learn about them, and they are so unusual in so many different ways. But I guess for now, do you have anything else to add about them?
Well, I guess the only thing so we can move forward. I oh, and maybe you remember this a couple of years back. There was a video that was shared around
Uh-huh.
all over Twitter of the snoring hummingbird.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I don't know if snoring is the correct term, but I always think about that when it comes to like hummingbirds and vocalization. It's
You're
like
right.
not something you see every day.
No, no, yeah, that is true. Yeah, I remember that. To be honest, I'm not sure what the correct or technical term for that would be either, but yeah, it's definitely a very cute video. Right, yes. Yeah, that's what hummingbirds sound like. I guess before we, completely leave them behind, let's talk a bit about the fossil record of hummingbirds, which is surprisingly good. Um, so, on the next slide here, I've shown a couple of examples of stem hummingbirds. And so, on the left here is one of the earliest hummingbirds that we know actually looked like basically like a modern hummingbird. And this is Eurotrochilus, which is known from several species from the Oligocene of Europe and at several different sites. This particular specimen, which is one of the best preserved ones, it was found in France, but it hasn't been assigned to any particular species yet. And you can see here, again, feathers are preserved, so you can see it's basically shaped like a modern hummingbird. And in a lot of ways, it looks a lot like a modern hummingbird in its skeleton as well. You have the long bill, you have the very distinctive wing skeleton. It does differ from modern hummingbirds in a few small details, but overall, there's no mistaking that is a hummingbird. And so, yeah, that one is known from the Oligocene, and that's basically when we can be sure that hummingbirds looked like modern hummingbirds for most part. But there are some older fossils of hummingbirds, and those fossils, a lot of them are only known from the wing skeleton, and because the hummingbird wing skeleton is so distinctive, we can be pretty sure that they are stem hummingbirds. But we don't really know if they have a hummingbird-like beak or the rest of the skeleton was all like modern hummingbirds yet. However, we do have this other fossil from the Meso called Paragornis. And Paragornis is very interesting because Paragornis, as you can see, it also preserves feathers. And, if you think back to when we were introducing Apodiforms, you'll remember that one of the main differences between hummingbirds and swifts is that they have a very similar wing skeleton, but in hummingbirds, the wing feathers are relatively much shorter, whereas swifts have ridiculously long wing feathers. So, Paragornis here preserves these wing feathers, and it preserves, a rather typical apodiform forelimb skeleton. But because it preserves the wing feathers, we can tell that it has relatively short wing feathers, like a hummingbird, and not like a swift. Something else that is interesting is that the skull of Paragornis. So it's pretty mushed up, so a lot of the details are not really visible. But what is there, from what is there, we can tell that it has a very short skull, more like a swift than like a hummingbird. And so what Paragornis seems to tell us is that hummingbirds first evolved their short wings before they evolved their long bill. So that is a very cool bit of information that this specimen tells us.
Wow.
Yeah. So what was it doing? Well, there is no obvious kind of analog to this today. There's nothing that's flying around today with a hummingbird-like wings and a swift-like head. But it has been speculated that maybe, for example, maybe it was specialized for hovering at the edges of the foliage or like the edges of trees, for example, and kind of picking insects off the sides of, off the leaves or whatever. And then from there, maybe it eventually, something similar to Paragornis eventually specialized to become a nectar feeder. So, yeah, so turns out we know quite a bit about how to turn a dinosaur into a butterfly, and is thanks to specimens like these. All right. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
All right, cool. Okay, so one final, I think, fossil that I'll show here is this next one is called Eosipsalis. Um, so Eosipsalis also kind of fills in a piece of that puzzle for how to turn a dinosaur into a butterfly, because what Eosipsalis seems to be is that it seems to be a stem apodiform. So, we saw swifts and hummingbirds are both kind of extreme in terms of morphology in different directions. So, was the last common ancestor of swifts and hummingbirds more like a swift or more like a hummingbird? Um, that's something that only the fossil record can tell us directly. Unfortunately, we do have a fossil that seems to give us some hints, and that is Eosipsalis, which is known from two different species, one from Europe and the other from North America. So this is the North American species, which is known from this very lovely specimen. So what you're seeing here is the specimen has been it's the same skeleton, but it has been split along two different slabs. So it was preserved flattened, which a lot of these Green River fossils are. It's kind of been split in two, so it's scattered on these two slabs, both of which preserve parts of the feathering. And so, Eosipsalis seems to be a stem apodiform, so it's equally closely related to both swifts and hummingbirds. And as it turns out, because it preserves its wing feathers, we can tell how long its wing feathers were, and it seems to have an intermediate wing shape between swifts and hummingbirds, so it's relative to its body size, longer wing feathers than in a hummingbird, but shorter than in a swift. And so it turns out the answer to the question about what their last common ancestor was like was probably a bit of both. So that's pretty cool.
That sounds about right to me.
Right. All right, so yeah, again, thanks to these fossils, we have a pretty good idea of Strisorean evolution. Yeah, on the next slide, you can kind of see the phylogeny of Apodiforms. In Apodiform phylogeny is pretty well figured out and has been for a while. In fact, it's not very controversial. The treeswifts are most closely related to the true swifts, and in turn, they're closely related to the hummingbirds. And Eosipsalis is a stem member of that group of crown Apodiformes. All right, but on the next slide, we can kind of see how Apodiforms fit in with the rest of Strisores. So even though we have this really good fossil record for the many members of Strisores, the phylogeny of Strisores has been very, very controversial for a long time, which is kind of interesting. And I guess part of the reason for this is because, we saw a lot of those fossils, but a lot of them are recognizably, stem members of a lot of these major groups. Like the stem Potoos kind of looked basically a lot like the modern Potoos, and the stem Frogmouths looked a lot like the modern Frogmouths. So because of this, it's been very tricky to figure out kind of what the very ancestral members of Strisores would have looked like. And even once we had genetic data, this problem was still very hard to figure out. Like, almost none of the analyses that were run using different amounts or different types of genes found the same kind of topology. So for a long time, there was just no consensus at all about how the members of Strisores were related. And kind of because of this, my supervisor, Daniel, when I first started my PhD, asked me, there's this problem here, and, there's room for more research to be done on the subject. Do you want to do a project on this? I'm like, heck yeah, I love Strisores, and this is a very big problem in terms of, modern bird phylogenetics. So yeah, I would love to do that. So I did. And what I did was I collaborated with some geneticists who had sequenced a new data set of genetic sequences for this group of birds, representing all the major groups and with very, very large amount of genetic data. And then I took this data set and combined it with a morphological data set. So I, included anatomical information from living members of this group, but also the fossils too. And a lot of that was built up upon like previous literature. So definitely kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here. but no one else had ever tried to combine morphology and molecules in such a large, comprehensive data set in the past for this particular group. So I did that. And as it turns out, when I ran those analyses using this combined data set, I found this particular topology. And kind of quite interestingly, this particular topology had already been previously found by another molecular data set using just molecular data and using different types of genes. So this was basically the first independent evidence of a topology that someone else had already found before, essentially, using an entirely different data set. And since my study has been published, there have been a couple of other studies that have looked at phylogeny of this group, and they have found pretty much the same topology here. So it seems like we are finally moving towards a consensus for the relationships of this group, which is really cool. Yeah, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, that's exciting.
Definitely. And so I've labeled kind of the major clades here, not just like the ones we went through with earlier, but also the groups that where they're united with each other. So I guess a little bit of self-indulgence here because I helped name a few of these clades. So the ones that I named were Vanus caves. So Vanus caves includes all the members of Strisores except for the nightjars. And the name Vanus caves means vanishing birds in Latin. And the reason I chose this name was because a lot of the members of this group have much more restricted distributions in the present compared to their fossil record, whereas the nightjars are pretty much globally distributed. And, if you were paying attention earlier, you might recall this. Oilbirds today are only found in South America, but we have fossils from Europe and North America. Potoos today are found in the Neotropics, so Central and South America, but there are fossils from Europe. Frogmouths today are only found in Australasia and parts of the continental Asia, but there are fossils in Europe and maybe North America. Let's see. Owlet-nightjars don't really have a really good fossil record, so they're kind of exempt for this. But if that one fossil from Germany is a stem Owlet-nightjar, they'd fit the pattern as well. Swifts are found all over the world, but hummingbirds are today only found in the Americas, but their fossil record is best in Europe. So it seems that these birds have undergone a rather dramatic kind of range shifts during the evolutionary history. And this is a kind of a pattern we've seen before. If you remember turicos, do you remember turicos?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, today they're only found in Africa, but there are possible stem members of turicos from North America and Europe dating to the Eocene. And we will see this pattern again and again. So I think I'm going to save kind of the details or why this might have happened for a later episode. But nonetheless, because of this pattern, I decided to call this group of Strisores Vanus caves. It is also a bit of a reference. It is a reference to the poem A Root of Evanescence by Emily Dickinson. So this poem is about a hummingbird, or it describes a hummingbird. And so because of that, I thought it would be a kind of an appropriate namesake. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another group that I helped named is Sedentaves. So this is a group uniting Oilbirds and Potoos. And so Oilbirds and Potoos are quite different from each other in terms of their morphologies. Potoos are a lot more similar to nightjars, for example, and for the longest time people thought that Potoos and nightjars had to be each other's closest relatives because of that. But the molecular data is very consistent that Oilbirds are more closely related to Potoos. And so one of their few anatomical features that they do share is that, I mentioned this earlier, they both have a very short foot. And I guess this might help them, be able to stay perched for very long periods of time, maybe. So sedentaves basically means sitting birds, so kind of referencing this fact. And so that's why I picked that name. Now, there's a third name that I helped name here is Litornithes. And so Litornithes unites the Frogmouths, the Owlet-nightjars, and the Apodiforms. So yeah, this was I think the trickiest clade for us to name. So me and my supervisor Daniel, we thought about the name for this clade for a long time, partly because this clade doesn't really have that many very obvious anatomical similarities for us to base a name around. And so we were just thinking, God, what would be a good name for this clade? Eventually, we settled upon Litornithes, and the reason for this is we named this after the Greek goddess Leto. And so there aren't many surviving myths about Leto, but there is one thing. There are a few things that seemed kind of relevant. So first of all, is that she was the mother of Artemis, who is the goddess of the night, and also, well, the goddess of the moon, and also of the hunt. Well, which group of Strisores, regularly hunts other vertebrates? And that is the Frogmouths, which are active at night. So, goddess of the moon and the hunt, parallels. Leto was also the mother of Apollo, who was the god of the sun, and also the god of the arts. And so, the Apodiforms are the only diurnal group of Strisores, and additionally have all these, very super elaborate visual and acoustic displays, the arts, So, we thought that it was appropriate that, Litornithes is a group that unites both the Frogmouths and the Apodiforms.
Really cool how well that all fits together.
Yeah, we were pretty pleased with that, if I may say so. There's also kind of another fun tangent related to this, is that one of the surviving myths about Leto talks about how basically she turned a group of peasants into frogs because they disrespected her. And well, frogs and frogmouths, right? Kind of a connection there. So yeah. So we mentioned that in the paper where we named this clade as well. So yeah. Now the last clade that I haven't mentioned yet here, I did not name this clade, is Daedalornithes. Now Daedalornithes unites the Owlet-nightjars and Apodiforms, and it was named by a guy named George Sangster, who has done a number of other taxonomic work on birds and named a number of other clades. So this one is also named after a Greek mythology, and named after Daedalus, who if you've heard of the story of Icarus, Daedalus was the father of Icarus and the one who invented the wings that Daedalus and Icarus used to escape from the labyrinth. Well, as you probably know, if you heard the story of Icarus, Icarus didn't make it. But yeah, because Daedalornithes includes many very skilled flyers, George Sangster decided to name the clade after him, after Daedalus. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. We're finally starting to get a much better picture of the relationships and evolution of this group of birds. Do you have anything else to mention related to that?
Well, I do know the Daedalornithes, like that's another perfect name for sure. I have seen in some literature that they just kind of, like, some authors will just put the Owlet-nightjars into Apodiforms.
Yeah, right.
Use that name instead.
Right. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've seen that too. It's definitely justifiable. It's like, if the group is already there, we might as well just sink it in. Yeah, I think the main argument against that is that Apodiformes has been used for a long time to mean specifically the swifts and the hummingbirds, and so there's an argument to be made to preserve that. Yeah, I mean, in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's just what your personal preference is. Yeah.
Daedalornithes for sure. Like that's very.
I do like that name. Yeah. I guess something else I should mention is that I mentioned at the very beginning that it used to be thought that all the nocturnal groups were more closely related to each other and kind of formed a clade independent of the Apodiforms. Whereas now we know that some are more closely related to the Apodiforms than to other nocturnal members. So this relationship was actually, first first recovered not using genetics, but actually using morphological data. So in the early 2000s, Gerald Meyer, I mentioned him earlier, he ran a phylogenetic analysis using only anatomical characters, and he found evidence that the Owlet-nightjars are the closest living relatives of Apodiforms and are not especially closely related to the other nocturnal members of Strisores. And of course, at first, a number of people were skeptical of this, but genetic data again and again kept supporting this, that the Owlet-nightjars are the closest living relatives to Apodiforms. And it was really the remaining groups that nobody else agreed on until recently. So so that's pretty cool that at first that we were able to recognize this relationship through anatomy. Right. Okay. So anytime I talk about Strisorean phylogeny, and I mentioned this, the nocturnal groups do not form a clade. Well, quite a lot of people inevitably start putting two and two together. So let's go to the next slide, because they will often ask the question, does this mean that the swifts and hummingbirds evolved from a nocturnal ancestor? That's a very good question, and it's it definitely seems very reasonable, because take a look at this. So I use like emojis here to represent kind of their life habits. So the moon emoji denotes all the nocturnal groups here. So nightjars, oilbirds, Potoos, Frogmouths, and Owlet-nightjars are nocturnal groups, and the Apodiforms represent the one diurnal group. And so if some of these nocturnal groups are more closely related to the diurnal Apodiforms, might this mean that the last common ancestor of a Strisores was a nocturnal bird, and Apodiforms kind of evolved back into like diurnal birds? So I kind of represented this on the next slide. So a nocturnal ancestry, and then secondarily diurnality evolving in the Apodiforms. Now, that is a possibility, and that would be very interesting. So if you assume that, transitioning between diurnality and nocturnality was equally possible, then this would be the simplest explanation, right? So you have one origin of nocturnality in the entire group, and then one origin of diurnality. Straightforward. However, there are reasons to think, or to suspect, that the story might be more complicated than that. And so one of those reasons is that we actually know of very few cases where animals have evolved from a nocturnal ancestor reverting back to diurnality. And even when it happens, there are often, very telltale signatures that it has happened. And, well, what do I mean by this? Okay, so ancestrally, all vertebrates have 4 types of color receptors in their eyes. So, they're most sensitive to 4 different types of wavelengths of light. Very good color vision if you have 4 different types of color receptors. And most fish, I think, still retain 4 color receptors. Most types of reptiles retain 4 color receptors, including most birds. And as you might guess from the very elaborate visual displays in hummingbirds, hummingbirds have extremely good color vision, and are very discerning in terms of their color vision. So they kind of they seem to retain this kind of full complement of color receptors. However, a lot of the nocturnal Strisorians, I'm not sure if color vision has been studied in a lot of the nocturnal Strisorians, but definitely in other nocturnal birds like owls, they often lose a lot of the color receptors, and a lot of other types of nocturnal animals in general often lose color receptors. And a very well-known example, very well-studied example, is in mammals. So there's evidence that mammals seem to have been ancestrally nocturnal. And that is why most mammals have reduced color vision compared to other vertebrates. Yeah, there's this very a common misconception that animals don't have very good color vision. That is not really true if you look across like all vertebrates, or even across all animals, because a lot of insects have doing interesting things with their color vision. But it's definitely not true across all vertebrates. The ancestral condition for all vertebrates is having very good color vision. But because mammals seem to have gone through this nocturnal phase, they have reduced their color receptors. And so most mammals alive today only have 2 color receptors. And so they're basically the equivalent of being red-green colorblind. And so this is where the misconception comes from, is because, we're most familiar with mammals, and the things like dogs and cats are red-green colorblind. And so people just assume, oh yeah, animals are colorblind. No, that is wrong. That not all animals are colorblind, far from it. Most mammals are red-green colorblind, including our ancestors. Now, you might recall from, Jones' series on primate evolution that primates have become diurnal. And related to this is that, some groups of primates, including our lineage, have regained color vision. But we haven't been able to regain the full complement of 4 color receptors that were ancestrally present in all vertebrates. We only have 3 color receptors, and even then it sometimes fails to work, because quite a large percentage of people are red-green colorblind. In any case, so in our case, we are diurnal animals that evolved from nocturnal ancestors, and we have quite a rather telltale signature of that, in that we don't have the full complement of 4 color receptors, but hummingbirds and swifts seem to. So it would be very weird and unusual for a group with nocturnal ancestors to have retained all 4 color receptors. And furthermore, I kind of mentioned this earlier, the different groups of nocturnal Strisoreans seem to have different adaptations for night vision, at least the ones that have been studied. So I mentioned earlier the oilbird has many, many layers of rod cells, and that's how it has this really good night vision. The Potoos and the nightjars have a different system. So they have a membrane called the tapetum lucidum, which is also common in a lot of nocturnal mammals. And this is a reflective layer in the back of the eye, which basically catches any light that the retina of the eye didn't detect on the first go around. So when the light first hits the eye, if any of it kind of slips through, the tapetum membrane catches that light and reflects it back towards the retina, and so it allows the eye to capture more light and see better in low light conditions. And so nightjars and Potoos have this system, and so if you go out at night and shine your flashlight around, if it hits the light, the eyes of a nightjar or Potoo, you can detect them quite easily, because you'll see the eye shine there. Now the Frogmouths and Owlet-nightjars, their eyes have not actually been studied in very good detail, but field biologists who have studied these birds have said, apparently, that they don't really seem to have an eye shine, so it seems likely that they also have a different system from the tapetum lucidum that the Potoos and nightjars have. So, let's go to the next slide in light of that information. So there is a possibility that instead of being ancestrally nocturnal, the Strisores instead evolved nocturnality many, many times. And so if we take kind of the different night vision systems of oilbirds and Potoos as evidence, then they might have evolved nocturnality up to like 5 separate times in all these different groups. And that seems very counterintuitive. But at the same time, it's entirely possible. And definitely we do see in other groups, groups that have a certain predisposition towards repeatedly evolving a certain feature. And we kind of saw this earlier in the series before, if you recall the paleognaths, right? So the paleognaths, it was long thought that they evolved flightlessness with just a single time. But now with our current knowledge, we now think that they probably evolved flightlessness many times and just kind of sort of had a predisposition towards it. And we know this kind of pattern happens in many other groups of animals too. For example, live-bearing young instead of laying eggs has evolved many times in lizards. Like, it involves a ridiculous number of times. You think that live-bearing is a really complex trait to evolve, right? But in lizards, it has evolved something like over 100 times.
Wow.
Yeah, like that's not exaggeration. Like, yeah, that's how often it evolves independently. Um, so it is not always clear what predisposes a group to independently evolving a certain trait so many times, but we are able to observe patterns where this seems to be a thing. And so it might be that in Strisores, they just had a predisposition towards evolving nocturnality. Now, of course, we are still not entirely sure which model is correct, whereas it is secondarily diurnal apodiforms or multiple origins of nocturnality. It would be really, really nice if we got like very early members of Strisores that represent kind of these very deep diverging branches at the ancestral state of these, and maybe we might be able to get some clues, for example, from eye size, things like that, about what is the ancestral condition. But either way, this is still one of the remaining mysteries that we have to solve regarding the evolution of this group. Alright, I think this is my last main slide in this episode, so do you have anything else to add?
No, I'll just say, it's certainly a fascinating case study of evolution. Like this just this possible continuous evolution of
Yeah,
nocturnality.
right, absolutely.
It worked out, and so a bunch of different related groups just kept on doing it.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So, very, very curious. Yeah, I definitely hope we kind of unlock the next piece of the puzzle very soon. But yes, hopefully after this, you understand why I think Strisores is such an interesting group. It definitely includes some of the most remarkable, I would say, most remarkable dinosaurs ever to have lived. Um, so, yeah, who says the Cenozoic dinosaurs aren't cool, right? Now, all right. So, yeah, the next slide, we're going to preview the next group we're going to cover. Now, the next group I've decided to cover is a group called Gruiformes. Gruiformes includes the cranes and the rails and a few of their other cousins too. And so they're a pretty interesting group because a lot of them have strong cultural significance. Cranes feature quite prominently in a lot of human cultures. However, many members of this group are very secretive birds that are very poorly understood, and so there's still quite a lot of mysteries about them. Um, and speaking of kind of a predisposition towards evolving a certain kind of trait, we're going to see how this particular group also has a predisposition towards evolving a particular kind of trait. In addition to Gruiformes, I also want to tie up a final loose end from kind of the major neo-avian groups. If you paid attention during the previous episode of a Dinosaurs, the second chapter, you can probably guess what that particular loose end is. But anyways, all will be revealed next time in a couple of weeks or something like that. All right, so without further ado, special thanks to our friends, as usual, for the music in Henry's case and for my color scheme in Alicia's case. Um, and if you want to keep up with us, follow us on Twitter. We will share the news whenever we upload a new episode. Of course, you can also subscribe directly to our YouTube channel. You can email us if you have questions. You can also comment directly on the videos too. We haven't turned comments off for now. And there will be links to references for this episode as usual in the description. Otherwise, I think next time we'll go back to Jones series, right?
Yep, that's right. We're going to cover the earliest members of the genus Homo and their subsequent adventures in Eurasia, as well as other related topics.
Wow, out of Africa. That sounds exciting.
Oh yeah, and it's surprisingly a lot more complicated than you might think.
Right.
So I'm definitely excited to kind of break that down for everyone.
Cool. That sounds super cool. Excellent. So look forward to that, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and take care.
Yep. See you, everybody.